Okay, so welcome back. So today we will be going over loops, right? More specifically, we're going to be going over the while loop and also the do while loop, right? So, what is a loop? So, you can think of a loop um, as something that allows you to basically iterate over a particular thing a given amount of time. So if I were to say, hey, listen, I want you to loop over this array 5 times, or I want you to loop over this given data set a given amount of times. Like I want you to loop over this entire database of these particular numbers like 10 times, then it'll basically loop 10 times. But whilst it's looping, you would then have the benefit using programming to then tell it to do particular things, right? So whilst it's looping 10 times, you maybe wanted to increment a particular value. Whilst it's, looping a particular number of times, you might want it to multiply a particular value, or you might want it to do something, right? But looping allows you to basically do a same process over and over again for a given number of times. So let's just start by having, right? No, no, let me not while loop. Let's just start by having a particular, or let's just go over the architect of while loops, right? So we're going to have while, right? Condition, right? And then there we go. And then, processing. We've already went over this, by the way. And then here, we basically then are going to be, this is the end. So as you can see that the architecture of a while loop is essentially the same or similar to the architecture of a if statement. And the reason being is because, I don't know if you're paying attention, but I called the if statement a conditional statement. And the reason being why it's a conditional statement is because it checks if a particular condition is true or if a particular condition is met, and then it outputs something. The same could be said for the while loop. The while loop is just another form of a conditional statement because it checks if a particular condition is met or a particular condition is true, and then it basically does some form of processing, right? The only difference between the while loop and the if statement is that the if statement only compiles once. It only runs once. It's only going to check if 5 is less than 2 once. It's not going to do that over and over again. Whereas with the while loop, it's going to check if a particular condition is true. If 5 is less than 2, then I basically want you to loop or do the exact same thing over and over and over and over again up until we have reached a breaking point, up until we have reached a particular sentinel value that we want to pass down into our conditional statement so that it can break when that sentinel value is then met. So this is how we basically go about doing this, right? So you can think of it like this. So let's just declare a variable, a count variable, right? And then we can say whilst count is less than 10, I want you to, right? So we're going to have count plus plus. While count is less than 10, excuse me, basically cout count. But we want them to basically be displaying one after the other, right? Okay, so let's go for it. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Okay, so that's basically it, right? So that's what we were doing. We've checked if the count variable is less than 10. Now this is the beauty about while loops, is that you don't necessarily have to already have a predefined value assigned to a variable. So as you can see here that we've declared the count variable, right? but let's just be more, technical and just say that it's equals to 0. Let's assign it a value, even though its default value is 0, but let's just, be more technical here. Let's just assign it a particular value, which is 0. Even though count is equals to 0, if we were to try to do something similar with an if statement would basically look at whatever value is here, the count variable, the count, and that value, according to the if statement, is the value that it's going to be taking. It does not allow for flexibility. It takes the value count, and then probably you were going to say maybe if I don't know, if count is less than 10, then it should sort of like let's just say then it should see out count, right? It should see out count, right? So let's just try to essentially let's just try to run this, right? Let's just try to run this. There, right? 0, right? It does not continue to loop a particular number of times. The only thing that it does is, if count is less than 10, then it is only going to be doing one thing. It's only going to be outputting once. It's not going to be running, twice, thrice. It's only going to be running once, right? And it only takes the predefined value of that variable, or the sentinel value of the variable, and it then basically does its processing with the given value assigned to that variable. But as you can see here with the while loop, it essentially allows us to have flexibility, because now I can have the value of the count variable as 0, but within the while loop I can then change the value of the count, because now what's happening is, when it loops for the first time, well, count is equals to 0, right? So when it's looping for the first time, let's do this, right? When it's looping for the first time, right, let's just say #1. When it's looping for the first time, count, right, is equals to 0, right? And when it loops for the second time, count is equals to 1. When it loops for now the third time, count is equals to 2. So that's basically what it does. But up until count, it now starts to approach 10, or up until count is at number 9, that's when it's basically going to stop. That's when it's going to reach its breaking point. It's not going to break because we've given it that condition that, listen, man, count has to be less than 10 in order for this entire thing to basically continue processing. So that is essentially while loops, right? While loops, that's it. There is no magic attached to it. That's it. But my main gripe with while loops is this, right? Let's just do this. Let's just do this, right? Let's just remove that line, the count line. Now I want you guys to see what's going to happen. So it was that integer count is equals to 0. Whilst count is less than 10, it should do this. I want you to see something. Let's run this application. Okay, so it's basically looping an infinite amount of time. Why is it doing that? It's because the count variable, we've made it permanent. It's equals to 0. That's it. So the count variable is equals to 0. So it's going to be looping an infinite amount of times, because the count variable is never going to approach this 10 value. It's always going to be staying at 0. So it's just going to loop up until infinity. It's going to be looping up until infinity. You can think of it as if, say, for example, your family, they just basically created a will, right? So maybe your mom, your dad, when you were born, they created a will. They drew up a will for you, and they said that once he is, say, at the age of 18, he can then sort of pull out 50,000 from our savings, or for the allocation that we've set aside for the will, he can pull out 50,000. He can use 50,000 of that money for maybe say educational purposes. Once he's 21, he can then pull out maybe say 100,000 for starting a business or whatever the hell that's going to be. So it basically has a time limit. It has a time constraint which states that you can only access this particular thing once you've reached that particular age. So if you are, I don't know how, but if you were just something that does not grow in age, if your age was just always one, if you were always 1 years old, right? Then you essentially would never get the money because we need you to be at the age of 18 in order for you to actually be eligible to get the money. And then you also need to be at the age of 21 in order for you to get 100 G's. So that's essentially how this entire thing works. That's just while loops in general. And then we have do while loops, right? So now we have do while loops, right? Let me just so the only thing that's different about the while loop and the do while loop, it's architecture, how it's written, the syntax of it. Excuse me. So, right, let's excuse me. And so then we're going to increment this count variable. So that's essentially what's happening, right? The architect of these, the do while loop and the while loop, the only thing that is different, right? So there it is. We are basically saying it should do. We're starting with the preserved keyword do, and then we're saying at the end while, right? While this particular condition is met, whilst count is less than 10, it should basically increment count. So once it's incrementing count, I then wanted to basically see out the count variable. And so let's just try and run this. It gives us exactly the same output as we got with our while loop. So those are just while loops in general. Yeah.